What does it mean when a ship survives but the people do not? For as long as human beings have crossed open water, we have treated the sea as both road and mirror. It carries our trade, our hunger, our ambition. It also reflects back something older than language, the unsettling fact that nature does not owe us an explanation. Again and again, across more than a century, ships have been found wandering without voices. Their hulls remained afloat, their cargo often stayed in place. A cup sat on a table, a meal cooled in the galley, a chart lay open beneath a cabin lamp, and yet the people who gave the vessel meaning had vanished, as if erased from the scene while the stage itself was left standing. That is what makes these stories endure. They are not simply disasters, and they are not merely puzzles. They live in the narrow space between evidence and imagination. A storm can be measured, a wreck can be mapped, but an empty ship drifting under a calm sky asks a different kind of question. Not only what happened, but how so much ordinary life could stop so quietly. In the years since these vessels were discovered, explanations have accumulated like tide lines. Panic, mutiny, mechanical failure, weather, human error, private despair. Some theories are plausible, some are poetic. None fully dissolve the strange stillness at the center of these cases. The facts remain stubborn, and the silences around them remain larger still. So this is not a journey into spectacle. It is a journey into absence, into the moments when modern certainty breaks apart and leaves us staring at a cabin door, a missing logbook, a lifeboat gone into open water. We begin there, on that uneasy threshold, where the sea keeps the ship and takes the story. And we ask a very old question in a very human voice. When the evidence remains, but the witnesses are gone, what kind of truth is left for us to find? What if the most famous ghost ship in history became legendary, not because of what was found, but because of what was missing? In December of 1872, a vessel named De Gratia came upon another ship adrift in the Atlantic, east of the Azores. From a distance, nothing seemed impossible. The hull still rode the water, some sails were raised. The ship had not been shattered by weather or war. But when sailors crossed over and stepped onto her deck, they entered one of the sea's longest silences. The vessel was the Mary Celeste. She had left New York only weeks earlier, bound for Genoa with a cargo of industrial alcohol. On board were Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their young daughter, and the crew. It should have been an ordinary commercial passage, one of thousands that stitched the 19th century world together. Instead, the ship was found empty, as though human life had been lifted out of it without disturbing the frame. The clues were almost tender in their normalcy. Personal belongings remained. Food stores were still aboard. The cargo was largely untouched. There were no signs of battle, no visible blood, no wreckage announcing catastrophe. And yet one lifeboat was gone, along with essential navigation instruments. The last log entry offered no confession of fear, no omen, no final crime. It simply stopped. That is the detail that continues to haunt. The Mary Celeste does not look like a scene of violence. It looks like interruption. A life paused in the middle of its own sentence. Over the decades, explanations have drifted in like wreckage. Perhaps fumes from the alcohol cargo frightened the captain into ordering a temporary evacuation. Perhaps a faulty reading, a rough swell, or the illusion of imminent explosion pushed them into the boat. These theories are not unreasonable. In fact, their very reasonableness is part of the sorrow. A moment of caution may have become a sentence no one could reverse. And still, the unanswered part remains. If they left only briefly, why did they never return? How does an entire family, an entire crew, vanish from a ship still capable of carrying their names across the ocean? The Mary Celeste endures because it reveals something unsettling about human certainty. We imagine that evidence leads neatly to truth, but sometimes the table is set, the door is open, and the story has already stepped beyond our reach. What if the sea does not always erase a story at once, but strips it away in layers? In 1921, a five-masted schooner called the Carroll A was found grounded off Diamond Shoals near Cape Hatteras, a stretch of coastline so dangerous sailors once spoke of it with a kind of exhausted respect. From shore, the ship looked wounded but not destroyed. Its tall mast still stood against the sky. Its shape was intact, yet no answering voice came from the deck. When rescuers finally examined the vessel, they found an emptiness that felt organized rather than sudden. The crew was gone. So were the lifeboats. Navigation equipment had disappeared. Personal effects were missing in uneven ways, as if departure had come with urgency, but not absolute chaos. In the galley, there were signs that food had recently been prepared. It was the kind of detail that turns a maritime incident into something more intimate. Someone had been living an ordinary hour before the ordinary world broke apart. The Deering had already drawn attention before she was found. Reports suggested tension between Captain William Merritt's replacement, Captain W.B. Wormall, and at least some members of the crew. There were whispers of unrest, fragments of testimony, odd sightings from passing ships. The era itself amplified the mystery. It was a time of labor anxiety, political suspicion, and widespread fear of radical movements. In that atmosphere, mutiny seemed plausible to many. So did piracy. So did smuggling gone wrong. Each theory carried the mood of its age along with the evidence. And yet the ship resisted becoming a simple case study. If mutiny occurred, where did everyone go? If they escaped by boat, why was there no clear trail of survival or wreckage that settled the question? The coastline nearby was already known for swallowing vessels whole, but the Deering's silence felt different. It was not the silence of an invisible sinking. It was the silence of departure without conclusion. That distinction matters. Some mysteries are born from destruction. Others emerge when too much remains. The Carroll A. Deering stood as a physical contradiction, a massive wooden vessel left behind like a sentence with its subject removed. Even now, it asks us to consider how fragile command can be, how quickly trust can dissolve, and how the border between accident and intention is sometimes blurred beyond repair. On the sea, as in life, we often search the wreck for answers, only to discover that what truly unsettles us is what managed to stay standing. What if some ships are not abandoned in a single moment, but emptied by exhaustion itself? In the summer of 1947, the MV Joyita left Samoa bound for the Tokelau Islands, carrying passengers, medical supplies, and cargo across a route familiar to Pacific mariners. It was not a glamorous vessel. It was a working ship, practical and worn, part of the quiet machinery that connects remote communities across great distances. When it failed to arrive, concern spread slowly at first, then with a hardening sense of dread. Weeks later, the Joyita was found drifting far off course. The sight was unnerving, not because the ship had sunk, but because it had not. The vessel was damaged, listing and partially flooded, yet still afloat. Her design made her unusually buoyant. In a cruel twist, the very fact that she could survive may have deepened the mystery. The ship remained above water, but the people aboard were gone. No passengers, no crew, no final account to bridge the distance between trouble and disappearance. The details suggested a chain of problems rather than a single dramatic event. One engine had failed, radio equipment was compromised, pipes may have broken, allowing water to enter. Loose cargo and a heavy list could have made the vessel appear moments from sinking, especially in darkness or panic. If those on board believed the ship was doomed, they may have abandoned the only thing that still had a chance to save them. That possibility is both logical and heartbreaking. Fear does not require foolishness. Sometimes it grows from evidence that is real, only incomplete. And yet uncertainty remained. Why was there no coordinated trail of rescue? Why had a ship capable of floating become the last place anyone saw its passengers alive? The Joyita offers a different kind of maritime lesson. Not all mysteries depend on strange forces. Some are born from failing instruments, bad luck, damaged communication, and the unbearable pressure of making decisions without enough time or clarity. That may be the most human element of all. We like to imagine disaster announces itself clearly, but often it arrives as a series of small wrong things, each one survivable until they gather into a single irreversible choice. The Joyita drifts through history as a reminder that people do not vanish only in legends. Sometimes they disappear in the ordinary shadow between what appears certain and what is actually true. What if a ship can be found almost untouched and still feel more disturbing than a wreck? In 2006, off the northern coast of Australia, authorities encountered a small tanker named the Jian Seng drifting in open water. At first glance, it looked less like a tragedy than a puzzle left deliberately unfinished. The vessel was intact enough to tow. There were no obvious signs of fire, collision, or violent struggle. But as investigators stepped aboard, they found no captain, no crew, and almost nothing that clearly explained where the ship had come from or where it had been going. That absence gave the Jian Seng its strange modern aura. Earlier ghost ships belonged to an age of canvas and celestial navigation, when the sea itself could still be imagined as a keeper of myths. But this was the 21st century. The world was mapped by satellites, shipping lanes monitored, ports logged, identities documented. A vessel was supposed to belong to a system. Yet here was a ship that seemed to have slipped through the grid. Its paint was weathered. Its equipment offered few solid clues. No cargo told a clear story. No crew remained to attach memory to metal. Even the ship's registry and ownership trail seemed uncertain, tangled in the murkier realities of modern maritime commerce, where flags of convenience, false names, and undocumented labor can hide in plain sight. The mystery, in other words, was not supernatural. It was bureaucratic, economic, and deeply human. One possibility was that the vessel had been involved in illegal fishing or fuel smuggling, then abandoned when it became inconvenient or unsafe. Another was that it had simply outlived its usefulness in a shadow world of under-regulated shipping. In that reading, the Jian Seng becomes less a ghost story than a portrait of globalization's forgotten edges, where ships move between jurisdictions more easily than people move between certainties. And maybe that is why it lingers in the imagination. The emptiness aboard the Jian Seng does not only raise the question of what happened to the crew, it also asks what kind of world allows a ship to drift without identity, history, or witness. The sea remains mysterious, yes. But sometimes the deeper mystery is the one we built ourselves. Vast systems of trade and labor so impersonal that when something disappears inside them, the silence can look almost natural. What if the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that unfold in full view of modern technology and still refuse to resolve? In 2007, a 12-meter catamaran called Cas 2 was discovered drifting off the coast of Australia. The weather was calm, the sea was passable, the vessel itself was not broken apart by some obvious catastrophe, yet the three men aboard had vanished, leaving behind a scene so ordinary that it became eerie. The engine was running, a laptop was switched on. Food sat out as if someone had expected to return within minutes. A life jacket remained on board. The table was set in the relaxed disorder of a real journey, not the aftermath of panic. It was as though time had paused in the middle of an afternoon and then quietly removed every person from the frame. The men were experienced enough to understand the water, and their route was not a legendary corridor of danger. That is what made the discovery feel so intimate. This was not an old square rigger found in some distant century, stripped of context by time. It was a contemporary leisure vessel, part of a world equipped with GPS, radio communication, and Coast Guard oversight. And still, certainty failed. Investigators proposed a sequence both simple and cruel. Perhaps one man fell overboard. Another jumped in to help. The third followed, or lost control while trying to maneuver the vessel back toward them. A boat can become impossible to reboard faster than most people imagine, especially if it continues drifting under power. In that reading, the tragedy required no violence, no conspiracy, no extraordinary force. Only seconds, instinct, and the sea's indifference to human intentions. That explanation is plausible, but plausibility does not always quiet the mind. The Cas 2 disturbs because it resembles the lives many people recognize. A weekend voyage, casual conversation, the assumption that the next moment belongs to us. Instead, it became a reminder that disappearance need not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it enters through a small misstep, an act of loyalty, a decision made before thought has time to catch up. And that may be the hardest truth these ships offer. We often search for mysteries in the distant, in the dramatic. But some of the deepest mysteries begin in the familiar, where routine gives us confidence, and confidence leaves us unguarded. The empty deck of the Cas 2 asks a quiet question that reaches far beyond the sea. How many turning points in life appear, at first, to be nothing more than an ordinary afternoon? What if a ship can carry the signs of struggle without ever revealing whether the struggle came from nature, from human hands, or from fear itself. In 2012, off the coast of British Columbia, a vessel later identified as the Nina was found adrift after months of uncertainty and scattered reports. She had once been a recognizable presence among tall ships, modeled after an earlier maritime age and used in film and sailing circles. But when she was discovered again, she no longer belonged to romance. She belonged to the harder world of aftermath. The vessel showed damage. Sails had been shredded. Parts of the rigging were compromised. The interior suggested that life aboard had not simply ended in calm. And yet, as with so many ghost ships, the most decisive evidence remained absent. The people who might have explained the sequence of events were gone. A damaged vessel can describe pressure, weather, and force. It cannot tell us the order in which fear entered the room. The Nina had set out on a voyage that already carried a certain degree of ambition. To travel by a replica-like tall ship in modern waters is to live partly in conversation with history, to accept slower rhythms and greater exposure than contemporary vessels usually demand. There is beauty in that choice. There is vulnerability in it too. When a ship is built to echo the past, it may also inherit some of the past's risks: dependence on weather, limited margins for error, and the timeless burden of command when conditions begin to shift. Investigators and observers considered severe weather, equipment failure, and the possibility that the crew faced worsening circumstances with too few options. None of these theories are extraordinary, but their simplicity is precisely what gives the story weight. We sometimes imagine that mystery requires impossible events. More often, it is born when recognizable dangers gather into an unknowable final hour. The Nina reminds us that the sea rarely provides clean endings. It returns fragments, not conclusions. A torn sail can tell us the wind rose. A compromised hull can suggest hardship. But the deeper question remains untouched. How did the people aboard understand what was happening while it was still unfolding? At the center of every abandoned ship, we see that human gap between event and interpretation. And perhaps that is the part of the mystery we recognize most in ourselves. Because life, too, often asks us to decide what a storm means before we can see how much of it is still coming. What if some ghost ships are not mysteries in the old romantic sense, but warnings written by the modern world? In 2014, a ship called the Lyubov Orlova drifted through headlines and imaginations long after it had ceased to be useful. Once an expedition vessel carrying tourists toward polar landscapes, it later slipped into neglect, debt, and legal dispute. When it was finally being towed away from a Canadian harbor for scrapping, the tow line failed. The ship broke free and began a lonely passage into the North Atlantic. No crew vanished from her decks in the traditional sense. By then, she was already empty, and yet she entered the same strange family as the abandoned vessels before her, because once again thus held onto the ship while stripping away the human narrative that had once made it legible. The image was irresistible: a derelict passenger vessel, loose in cold water, moving without destination. Reports and rumors amplified the mood. People imagined a drifting shell filled with shadows, with rust, with the residue of old journeys. The story spread because it touched something larger than maritime curiosity. Here was a machine built for wonder and leisure, then discarded into uncertainty when economics, regulation, and ownership no longer aligned. It was not merely lost. It was unclaimed. That distinction matters. Older ghost ships often provoke questions about a final emergency. The Lyubov Orlova provoked a different one. What happens to the structures we no longer wish to be responsible for? Ships, like buildings and institutions, do not simply disappear when they fall out of use. Sometimes they drift at the edges of our systems, reminders of promises withdrawn and purposes exhausted. For a while, the vessel's whereabouts became a matter of speculation. Sighting reports surfaced and faded. Experts debated whether it had sunk. The ship became more myth than object, suspended between confirmed fact and public imagination. And perhaps that is fitting. The Lyubov Orlova belonged to an age that documents everything. Yet even now, its last chapter remains blurred. Its story widens the meaning of abandonment. Not every ghost ship is emptied by panic at sea. Some are emptied more slowly, by bureaucracy, neglect, and the quiet violence of obsolescence. In the end, the drifting vessel becomes more than a maritime curiosity. It becomes a mirror of modern life, asking what else in our world continues moving long after care, ownership, and memory have let go? What if the sea's strangest stories are no longer hidden in remote centuries, but arrive on our screens in real time? In 2019, a cargo vessel named Alta began to attract attention not because it had been found after a dramatic search, but because it seemed to keep returning to human awareness after everyone had stopped expecting it. The ship had been traveling across the Atlantic when it reportedly lost power. Rescue attempts saved the crew, but the vessel itself was left behind, empty and adrift, to continue a journey no one intended. At first, it seemed like one more unfortunate maritime incident, the kind that would pass quietly into insurance files and shipping records. But the Alta refused to disappear neatly. Months passed. Then came sightings. A ship without crew, without command, moving according to weather, current, and chance alone, began to take on the eerie dignity of a wandering ruin. It was no longer a functioning cargo vessel. It had become an object lesson in how quickly purpose can fall away from the things we build. There is something uniquely unsettling about a modern commercial ship continuing onward after the people have gone. Such vessels are designed around schedules, tracking systems, destinations, contracts. They belong to a world of constant coordination. Yet remove the crew, and the machinery of global trade becomes strangely vulnerable, reduced to steel, momentum, and exposure. The Alta seemed to reveal the thin line between system and drift. Eventually, the ship washed ashore along the coast of Ireland, huge and silent against land that had no use for it. Photographs of the wreck carried a peculiar emotional charge. It looked less like a villain than like a survivor that had outlasted its role. Wind and salt had written the final chapters. Human planning had long since stepped aside. Unlike the older ghost ships, the Alta did not leave behind a vanished crew to haunt the imagination. The people were saved, and still the image lingers, because the mystery here is broader than disappearance. It asks what remains of meaning once intention is gone. A ship is built to travel towards something, but the Alta reminds us that motion and direction are not the same. In life, as at sea, many things continue moving long after the hands that guided them have let go. The deeper question is whether drift is always failure, or whether sometimes it is simply the final shape of a story no one remains to tell. What if the deepest mystery is not how a ship disappears, but how it returns carrying almost no memory of where it has been? In 2003, a vessel known as the High Aim 6 was found drifting off the coast of Australia. It was a Taiwanese fishing boat, substantial enough to suggest long days of labor and routine at sea. When authorities boarded her, they did not find a full scene of ordinary life frozen in place, as with some other ghost ships. They found something harsher: blood traces, damage, and a silence that hinted not at accident alone, but at conflict. The captain was missing. So was most of the crew. There were signs that whatever had happened aboard had unfolded under pressure, perhaps violently, perhaps in stages. The details pointed toward mutiny or criminal struggle more than weather or mechanical failure. Yet even when suspicion sharpens, certainty does not always follow. The ocean has a way of widening gaps in a narrative. A vessel may preserve fragments, but fragments are not the same thing as sequence. The High Aim 6 sits at a different edge of the ghost ship tradition. Some abandoned vessels invite speculation because almost nothing appears to disturbed. This one unsettles for the opposite reason. Too much had happened, and still not enough could be conclusively known. There is a special discomfort in evidence that gestures toward human wrongdoing without fully arranging itself into a complete account. It reminds us that mystery is not always born from emptiness. Sometimes it is born from partial revelation. Fishing vessels, perhaps more than many ships, occupy a demanding and often invisible corner of global life. They move through long stretches of fatigue, financial pressure, isolation, and hierarchical authority. In such worlds, tension can accumulate far from public view. The High Aim 6 therefore raises questions larger than a single vanished crew. What forms of desperation take shape when people are cut off from witness, from help, from the stabilizing presence of ordinary society? And how much suffering passes through the working edges of the world without leaving a language large enough to hold it? That may be why this case lingers. It is not only a maritime puzzle, it is a reminder that the sea can conceal not just natural danger, but human fracture. The ship drifts back into sight, but the moral center of the story remains obscured. And perhaps that is the hardest kind of mystery of all. Not the one that asks what nature did, but the one that asks what people became when no one was there to see them. What if the sea's most revealing mysteries are the ones that show us how little separates order from abandonment? In 2018, a small boat called the Sayo was discovered near Myanmar after drifting into view without the one thing that makes any vessel more than an object: the people aboard. There was no dramatic wreck line, no shattered mast announcing a grand disaster. What remained was subtler and in some ways more unsettling. The boat was there. The human story was not. Cases like this rarely become famous in the way the Mary Celeste did. They emerge briefly in regional reports, then fade into the larger weather of global news. And yet, they belong to the same haunting tradition. A vessel is built to carry intention. It exists because someone chose a route, stocked supplies, checked engines, watched tides, and imagined arrival. When such a boat appears empty, that whole architecture of intention collapses at once. The available clues suggested hardship at sea, perhaps worsening conditions, perhaps a desperate decision made under pressure. Small vessels are especially vulnerable to the compounded effects of weather, navigation trouble, fuel limits, and fatigue. On larger ships, there may be layers of redundancy, communication systems, backup plans. On smaller boats, the difference between manageable difficulty and irreversible crisis can be terrifyingly thin. A broken engine, a shifting current, a mistake made after too many sleepless hours, any one of these can begin to redraw the horizon. But what lingers is not only the practical explanation, it is the emotional contour of the scene. An empty, small craft feels intimate. It does not suggest only maritime mystery. It suggests interruption of the most ordinary human hopes: to return home, to finish a mile, to see land again, to be expected by someone waiting. That may be why even lesser-known ghost vessels matter. They resist becoming mere anecdotes because they expose a truth larger than themselves. Not every disappearance enters history with ceremony. Many vanish at the margins, carried by working people whose names never become legend. The sea does not rank the value of those lives, and memory should not either. In the end, the silent boat asks the same question as the famous ships before it. When a journey breaks apart far from witness, how do we honor what cannot be fully recovered except by refusing to look away? What if the pattern hidden inside these stories is not supernatural at all, but painfully human? By the time we have followed enough abandoned ships across enough decades, a shape begins to emerge. The vessels differ in size, era, and purpose. Some carried families, some transported cargo, some served industry, tourism, or fishing. Yet again and again, the same image returns. A ship remains, a crew does not, and the empty space between those facts becomes a canvas for fear, wonder, and interpretation. We are drawn to these stories because they seem to resist the modern promise that everything can be explained if only enough data is gathered. But the sea has always been a place where evidence arrives damaged. Wind alters direction. Water removes traces. Time widens silence. A floating vessel can preserve objects with eerie tenderness while erasing sequence, motive, and final intention. That is why a plate on a table or a lamp left burning can feel more unsettling than wreckage. Ruin explains itself. Interruption does not. And still, when we lay these cases side by side, the explanations often become less exotic than the legends built around them. Sudden weather, faulty equipment, poor communication, misjudged danger, labor conflict, illegal trade, fatigue, fear. None of these are dramatic in the cinematic sense. They are more intimate than that. They belong to the fragile architecture of ordinary decision-making, the countless judgments people make under uncertainty, often with too little time and too little information. Perhaps that is why ghost ships endure in the imagination of modern adults who have seen enough of life to distrust simple narratives. These vessels do not merely represent disappearance. They represent the limits of control. They remind us that civilization is full of systems we trust because they usually work: navigation, commerce, command, routine, expertise. At sea, those systems can fail quietly, and when they do, what remains is not always a villain or a miracle. Sometimes it is only absence. In that sense, the ghost ship becomes a philosophical object. It asks us whether mystery is something the world contains or something human beings create when evidence stops just short of comfort. Maybe the answer is both. We tell the stories to close the gap. The sea keeps opening it again. What if the reason these ships stay with us is not that they are inexplicable, but that they resemble memory itself? Over time, each abandoned vessel drifts away from the facts that first defined it and enters a second life in the imagination. Details sharpen or blur, depending on who tells the story. A meal left on a table becomes a symbol. A missing lifeboat becomes a theory. A torn sail becomes an omen. The ship remains physical, but its meaning begins to move. That transformation tells us something important about the human mind. We do not live by evidence alone. We live by interpretation, by pattern, by the emotional need to make silence speak. When we encounter an empty vessel, we are not just asking what happened on board. We are asking what absence means and why it unsettles us so deeply. The answer may have less to do with maritime history than with our own uneasy relationship to uncertainty. A ghost ship is, in one sense, a machine without its operators. But in another sense, it is a stage after the actors have left. The props remain. The weathered ropes, the charts, the engine room, the galley, the personal objects, all of it suggests human presence so vividly that the lack of actual people feels almost louder than disaster itself. We recognize the scene because our own lives are filled with similar traces: empty rooms, saved messages, clothes left in closets, places that continue to exist after the people who animated them are gone. This is where the sea becomes a mirror rather than a setting. The drifting ship reflects back a truth we spend much of life trying to soften. Nothing human is ever fully preserved. Not a journey, not a decision, not even a story. We inherit fragments and build meaning from them as best we can. Historians do this. Families do this. Nations do this. So do we, quietly, when we look back on our own lives and try to decide what a turning point really was. Perhaps that is why abandoned ships feel both historical and personal. They belong to oceans, storms, shipping routes, and investigations. But they also belong to the wider human experience of trying to understand what has already passed beyond explanation. In the end, every ghost ship asks a question larger than itself. When so much of life can only be reconstructed after the fact, how gently and how honestly are we willing to live with what remains unresolved? What, in the end, do these silent ships leave behind? Not proof of monsters, not evidence of cosmic design, not a simple argument that the world is stranger than reason can bear. What they leave is something quieter and more enduring, a record of human fragility moving across immense spaces and the unsettling beauty of questions that outlived the people who first carried them. From the Mary Celeste to the Joyita, from working boats and fishing vessels to drifting modern cargo ships, each story has offered a variation on the same image. Wood or steel remains. A route can be traced. Fragments of circumstance survive. But the center is missing. The voices are gone. And because they are gone, we are left not just to investigate, but to imagine. That act of imagination is both our gift and our burden. It allows us to feel empathy across time. It also tempts us to mistake mood for truth. Yet perhaps the value of these stories lies precisely there, in the discipline of not rushing to close them. A mature kind of wonder does not demand spectacle. It does not insist that mystery must be supernatural to matter. It recognizes that ordinary life is already filled with thresholds we do not fully understand. The instant caution turns to panic. The moment trust fails. The second a wrong decision becomes irreversible. The hour when a person looks at the horizon and knows there may be no clean way back. The sea magnifies these truths because it removes the familiar. Out there, consequence arrives without cushion. Distance becomes moral as well as physical. The smallest error expands. The smallest hope matters. An abandoned ship is therefore more than an artifact of maritime history. It is a meditation on what remains after intention breaks apart. It asks us to look at evidence with humility, at speculation with restraint, and at vanished lives with care. Maybe that is the final lesson. We are all, in some sense, travelers between certainties, leaving behind partial records for others to interpret. Logs end, signals fail, memory edits what it cannot bear to hold intact. And still we keep searching, not because we expect every silence to yield, but because the search itself is one of the ways we honor one another. The sea keeps many answers, but the questions it returns to us may be just as important. How do we face the unknown? How do we speak for the absent? And how do we remain human in the presence of what cannot be fully explained?